All right, so I've never quite done anything like this before, but I thought this would be the easiest way to kind of walk through how I approach figures and faces. It just took some time to like set up and get everything going, so I hope that it ends up being helpful. I've been doing a lot of thinking about kind of how I approach figures and faces, and I think everyone kind of has like their own approach and how they like to kind of take on things. But this is kind of just an overview of what I like to do. So I'm just gonna do like a 10 by 7 inch, make sure it's in 300 dpi, and work on that just for sketching and kind of demonstration purposes. All right. So just kind of setting up, make a new layer, and I'm not going to use any kind of like fancy brush for this demonstration. Sometimes I have like textures I like sketching with, but just for this I'll use just a regular brush with some pressure sensitivity. Hard round. Okay, I think that'll be good. So the first thing is to know that, like, I don't think there's any, like, linear path to kind of learning this type of stuff, and I think that there's a lot of different approaches that people can take, so this is just, like, one of a million ways to sort of solve the visual puzzle, so to speak, and when I was kind of, like, trying to think of how to explain my approach to figures and faces, I think the first thing that really comes to mind is the breakdown, the simplification. So, I don't know how to spell. Simplification. There we go. And I do this by kind of examining the figure. Well, not the figure. Whoops. The gesture. Sorry about that. Gesture. And the form. So these are kind of the first steps, is kind of getting down the gesture, which becomes kind of the intention behind the movement or the feeling of the movement and motion that you're trying to get. And I think it counts for both figure and face, and kind of like facial expressions and stuff, because it lays down the groundwork for how you're going to build on that, and it makes sure kind of things are feeling right when you put them down. So if I were to pull up myself, starting from kind of a base, I'd like to do maybe just a kind of form or gesture. I'm kind of doing this like just as, impromptu. So I'm trying my best to like come up with an idea quickly, which is something that I need to get better at too. But sort of a kneeling pose. We'll do like just a kneeling pose. I try to break it down into like, starting with sort of where the head is. I try to figure out how the gesture is shaped, and everybody has like a different gestural language. I like to build off of kind of the head and rib cage. I like to know which direction the ribcage is facing, because everything, if you know one part, like the body is going to kind of try to balance itself out. So I know that probably, his pelvis is twisting a certain way to try to do this. And I just try to figure out very loosely where everything is. Sometimes having the opacity on can sort of help you figure out things, because like it gives you a sense of what is overlapping what, because I know this isn't very clear, and that's the thing too, is like when you're watching people, they kind of have their own sort of gestural dialect that they're working in, so like it can be kind of sloppy. Keeping it loose is another really big part of my process anyway, to keep it loose. So when I'm kind of working, I'm not super concerned with making it look pretty, because I'm trying to get everything kind of in its right place. Sometimes I even work smaller, and I'll take this and blow it up later. Need to know where my knees are. And maybe his hands are behind his back or something like that. I don't know. One of the mistakes that I'm kind of making here is I didn't have like a very solid idea or intention of what's kind of happening to my figure. And that can make a big difference too, is like knowing that like, oh, I want to make a character, and I want to put the figure, and I want it in a very strong, imposing stance, or I want the figure to be kind of sheepish and shy, and sort of a very pin-up-y kind of pose. Be holding a fan. And like, don't be afraid to just use like a stick figure kind of formation. I've seen this kind of thing broken down before in a lot of different ways. How would that arm bend? But like just simplifying that and kind of keeping it loose, and making sure that you're not getting too detailed. Like, you don't want to flesh out parts of it yet, because you're just trying to like explore the pose and everything like that. Like, I might come over here too at some point and look up different kneeling poses. I mean, you can't see it, but I do have kind of a reference window that I can kind of like refer to for certain things, which is totally okay too. There's no such thing as stealing a pose, because there's only a finite way that the body can comfortably and naturally move. So you're going to have like similar kinds of poses. And I'm thinking about like where the shoulders are falling and everything, where the rib cage is, as I'm kind of like working from this. Where are the hips? Where are those hips? I don't know where those hips are in this image, but I can kind of get there, I think. That one's kind of fallen. Is this person leaning? Just keeping it loose, trying to figure out where things go, how the body works. Working from reference sometimes. The bottom foot is kind of facing that way. Trying to figure out the proportion of things that are foreshortened. I don't know. Let's see, she has kind of a foot going out, and she's sort of leaning downward, so her arms kind of right here, and then she has insanely long looking arms, but for some reason it seems like it's working for her. And yeah, I'm not drawing fingers or anything like that. Literally, the stage is just sort of a foundational, like, you know, getting the shapes right. And I've seen people. I used to have a friend who worked traditionally, and she would start in like a really light pencil or a light colored pencil. She really liked to incorporate like part of her sketch into her traditional work. So just keeping it light so that she could go back over. This guy right here is really bad. But the next part of that turns into kind of figuring out the form, and that's kind of where the anatomy comes in and how things actually function, which is where I might, you know, start to use a lot more reference in figuring out kind of how the meat works. So I've kind of kept it loose up to this point, and move forward with her maybe. All I did was jump this to a new layer so that I could... Whoa, apparently I didn't. Okay. Ooh, I'm still gonna keep that kind of small, actually. So kind of working on top of that, trying to keep everything loose, but trying to figure out how, you know, how the meat is going to work, how the forms are going to occur, and I'm still kind of staying in the simplest sort of stage. I might work on top of this one to kind of like figure out, okay, how is her spine kind of bending, how is her tummy. I'm basically giving myself a guide. I'm giving myself references to sort of work with, and I'm trying to think of how the exact meat is actually going to come together, and I'm keeping it simple. You know, I'm thinking of arms not as arms, but I'm thinking of them as like parts, like cylinders, like how, you know, what is the closest primitive shape I can think of? You know, might be a triangle or like a sphere. There's just like weird things going on with her legs. And, you know, in some cases too, it's okay to deviate a little bit from your reference because your pose that you're building might be slightly like off form. So here again, that's really just a triangle, and her kneecap would be functioning right here. But then, you know, you get these unique areas where, like, when you're building up, you're thinking about, you know, how that meat is going to smush. And that sounds super unappealing, but like every time you move your body, it's pulling muscles, it's smushing meat against different parts. So you gotta kind of like consider what that's doing. And I'm still not even really putting details in. I'm just trying to figure out exactly how that's working. And, you know, I get areas that are like, okay, her leg might be shorter, and I can move that over, and I can kind of fix things as I go. I think if you're working digitally, it's a lot easier to do stuff like this. Whereas, like, you can kind of do it. There's a little bit more forethought, I think, that goes in with traditional work. But, you know, she kind of has a thing going on where her foot is mostly being covered, so I probably won't focus as much on that, but she's got, like, you know, her hand is out here. Is it a thumb? Yeah, I think that's her thumb. Where's that boot kind of looking? Arm? And even with the face, like, these same kind of methods can be implied, or not implied, applied. Kind of going a little off form, just adjusting to what, like, is naturally sort of happening. Keeping it loose, not really caring if everything is perfect right now, as long as, like, it looks okay when I kind of squint. Might get kind of like a idea of what the silhouette of the hand is going to look like, of where the face is going to be, what is kind of smooshing down, where's your bone. So a lot of this too is observational. There's moments where, like, I will call my partner in and have him, like, pose, or I will take some time away and try to figure out, like, what my body is doing if I were in this situation, like, what does it feel like, what muscles are being affected, and just think about things in terms of what is happening to the body while in kind of this state. And, like, I could keep going, I keep refining down and everything like that. I might start to lay in refining details if I'm interested in, like, maybe turning, the shape of the head into, like, a different creature. I can start laying in different features that would make sense and sketching out kind of what I want this to look like. But it doesn't really matter, like, what kind of thing you're approaching, as long as you're, like, keeping it loose and keeping it simple. But that being said, let's see, we had one. Vacation. Gesture. And form. So breaking down the intention of the pose and kind of how it feels, and then breaking down the basic shapes that are going to kind of make the figure. You can see when I take that away, I'm left with kind of just sort of a basic, mannequin-esque version of what the final might, or, be after rendering. To keep it loose. 3, I tied in some references. So it's okay if you deviate from your references, but you need to know what you're kind of, like, looking for when you're looking for references. So specifically, I was kind of trying to get reference on how this arm kind of worked, and I did a lot of this pose from reference, which is completely fine, because, again, I didn't really start off with kind of an intention for it, so it helped to kind of just pull from reference for this character. I'm gonna put, like, a butterfly or something she's examining here. I have kind of a story. Alright, and, do so mindfully. It does, you can, like, look for references from very specific, things, like just the neck muscles or something like that, so you can get an idea of kind of what's happening underneath there. Get rid of this one and just kind of work. Oops. On top of this real quick. I like to, if I'm happy kind of with the way that the pose is looking, I will take it and blow it up. I work smaller to larger just to kind of make sure that I'm keeping it loose, but you definitely want to eventually start to work because of the resolution of things and stuff like that, you probably want to start working bigger at some point. So let's see. And I think another important thing is just you don't have to commit to anything that you're kind of doing at any point in time. You don't have to commit. In fact, you really shouldn't. If something's not looking right, you can just discard it. You can move things around until they do. Just because like a brushstroke, and I've come into this too, where I'm like, oh, that brushstroke is so juicy and good, and I like it, and I want to keep it. But like it's not working for the piece. And like it was a decision that I made that worked in the time being. But it doesn't work anymore for kind of where I'm at in the piece, and you want to let that stuff go. You don't want to hang on to it, because like the longer you hang on to it and try to make it work, the more time you're spending doing that and being frustrated over it than like letting it go and, finding the thing that does work. And I was kind of nervous to do this because my initial process is very sloppy. I do not typically start cleanup on things until I have a really good sense on where things are. I do not really jump into line art. And that's why, there's like a million different ways to approach it. Some people want to get all of the problems fixed right away, and they do this really beautiful, clean line art. And that's kind of how they operate. I've seen gesture and like counter posture and balancing out poses dissected as lemons before. I can probably link that video. It was very interesting to see it broken down that way, even if the YouTuber wasn't like necessarily my cup of tea. I'm trying to look for like directions things are going in. At this point, I might start getting rid of guides that aren't really helping me. And I think a lot of like my finish comes from just the rendering in general, but I like to kind of keep it a little bit loose and sloppy for myself so that I can so that I have a lot to kind of work with later. Like I have a lot to like look through, and I can kind of like sort of see the shapes in the clouds, so to speak. So like there's a lot of details that I've come across sort of happenstance because like I just kind of kept it loose and the forms built themselves. I'm gonna give her like fluffiness. Who doesn't like fluffiness, right? Just like crazy. That's maybe a little off. Yeah, again, don't commit. No need to. You can kind of explore shape and form. I might get rid of and I'm not concerned about the fur quite right now. I'm just sort of like trying to figure out exactly like what this form is going to kind of look like. What I want it to look like and what's working about it and what's not. Like what do I need to do to kind of like make this work. So a different layer. That's why you'll see like a lot of this reason right here is why you'll see like a lot of artists say they stopped painting on different layers and stuff like that. Is because it made them think about what they were doing too much, so they couldn't just like let it go. I think you can kind of like whichever process works for you is the best one, whichever one you find working. But I usually will like start, working with the forms that I built up and figuring out like what's happening with them, where things need to change. I will build on top of my line art or my sketch instead of refining it down a lot of times, because I like exploring what's happening with those things. Kind of lost a shape there. That was nice. Bring it back a bit. Shoulders out. What's happening with this fur in that shoulder? Her head's a little bit big. Much of this had to sketch. In this case, I might make a merged copy. Hard to do if you're like working traditionally, but if there's parts that aren't working, you can just kind of like, proportion them differently and then just go back in and clean it up. But I think just a really important part of approaching these figures is literally just keeping it, loose. And even the fur itself kind of becomes a gesture, like which direction is the fur moving in, and what is kind of like crunching down, where is the fur kind of at and why, what is it running into. Spending a really long time on this fur. I'm gonna, and I try to kind of move in passes over it, where I'm deciding, kind of the same kind of situation for everything in one pass, and then like I'll get to a different level of rendering. And this one's just kind of a black and white one. This is probably a little different. But there's things that like, I'm wanting to show that I think are particularly helpful. And other parts that like might not be as helpful. So let's see. Just kind of working on top of things. I personally start to kind of fold in like where there might be shadow, because it helps me define the form a little bit more, but I've seen it too equally where like somebody will work in a way that like they don't really pay attention to aspects of shadow until later, and that's fine too. Like, like I said, it's not like a linear process. Everyone's sort of visual language that they speak with is going to be a little bit different. But, I'm not really committing to anything I do yet. I'm just kind of like exploring where certain elements may be. Actually probably has like a curve to it that you might kind of patch up a little bit later. And then like this might be where I stop and kind of I'll end up focusing maybe on rendering at this point, because like for my process, I feel like this is descriptive enough, and everything else can start to be defined with, like, brush. You know, if I start catching myself wanting to go in here and do this with the fur, that's when, like, I think, okay, maybe I should start moving along. I think another handy tip is the liquefy. If you're working digitally, of course. If not, like, this, you can kind of, like, ignore this part. But the liquefy tool in the filter, liquefy, make a copy of your layer if you're nervous about, destructive filters. But filter, liquefy, if you have the latest, like, CC, I don't really know about the other ones, can help you sort of, like, move things around a little bit. Like I was saying, her arm might be a little bit more curved for this, because, like, her elbow would be taking a lot of this weight right here. Her arm also might be a little bit long, but, And same thing with just, like, this leg might actually be better going outward a little bit. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not committing to anything, so I'm not scared of, like, moving this around and having to, repaint something that I liked or something like that. Might come in here and just, whoops, there we go. Not scared of having to, like, redo anything to make my own pose sort of look better for myself. That looks worse. I'm also not scared of undoing everything I just did. There we go. That's actually probably fine. Let's see. But, I wouldn't have known if I didn't try that, like, I wanted to try that and see if I could kind of, like, extend that leg a little bit. Maybe this head again. That feels a bit better. And I'd kind of be thinking about, like, the environment, if I were building an environment in this. This is, I guess, more of a study, it becomes. Just trying to figure out where all that form is happening. There is something that accidentally happened right here that I really like. I'm gonna see if I can build on top of that. It's almost like a tuft of fur coming up over her shoulder where the shadow is, like, underneath. But all these things, again, can, like, apply to faces too. I try to think of, like, the emotion that I want to convey. If it's, like, happiness or anger, or if it's growling or whatever the emotion is. And, I think the best way, Cynics has a video where he talked about how faces could be broken down into, like, masks to get, like, those interesting dynamics. Or interesting, like, positions. Thinking of the face as a mask, I like to kind of think of them as, like, emojis or cartoons are really nice to think about, because, like, they simplify the emotions so that they are way more easily recognizable. And doing that for yourself can really help, like, with, I'm gonna do, like, sadly looking up. Sad, wistful. Figure out exactly, like, what the gesture of the emotion is, what is the feeling of that emotion, or like the most basic structure of it, and then trying to figure out exactly where your form is, and what, where are your cheekbones, can kind of be done in a very similar kind of fashion, where, like, you're just sort of structuring everything kind of around that idea. And I'm no master of this either. I just kind of, like, will start to try to figure out where things are and build up enough chaos, I guess, that I can start to read into it more than what is actually there. But, like, same thing with lizard faces or something like that. Like, I'm thinking about the basic forms, sort of the gestural structure of what that face would kind of, like, look like. And I'm keeping it loose, so I'm building enough chaos there that I can sort of, read into it, and start to pull shapes that I'm liking out of it. Just, does he have horns or spikes? I don't know. Well, kind of weird horns there. Maybe he's, like, snarling. I'm trying to figure out, like, where those forms lie. I'm going to try not to speed a lot of this video up, because I think that is sometimes deceitful of how long you kind of spend at this, but I will stay within the realm of kind of just this stage of exploring, like, shapes for, like, longer than it feels like anyone should. Because at the end of the day, it's the foundation for what you're going to do, and it can, like, help you start to, it can help you to have a strong foundation before you start rendering. Just because, like, you have a clear idea, you've solved some of the problems that you might have, like, maybe I actually look up a reference of some kind of snarling animal, which I've done before. Like, I've looked up the reference for the snarling animal and try to break down the shapes in that reference to figure out how they're applying to my own. Give them, like, fangs. Give him fangs later. Let's see. Maybe I'll give him... Looks like he has, like, one snaggle tooth. That might have been a very... It might seem like a small detail, but, if I want him to have snaggle teeth, I should probably have him have snaggle teeth early on, so that, like, I know exactly, like, how it's going to affect Oh, I think it's just one. How it's going to affect his anatomy in the way that, like, his lips are going to fold kind of over it. You know, he's going to have kind of a different structure if he just has one or two or none. Depending. And, like, I'm starting to get to a point where, like, I'm able to sort of see his forms. And I don't put any detail into the eye right away, because I don't want that to get, like, you know, overly crowded, or overly, like, rendered, and then, like, everything else has yet to be rendered, and I'm tired by the time, like, I finish the eye, and it's like, oh no, what are you going to do about the rest of it? I kind of try to render everything out. I try to render everything out in, like, you know, one smooth, you know, level of detail before kind of moving on and figure out what that snarl kind of, that snout's kind of doing. See, sometimes I find it easier to just kind of, like, think in terms of these broad strokes, and sometimes I don't think in terms of lines. So I'm really chaotic. I know there's a lot of other people who do not function quite as well, you know, like that, and they have their own kind of way. But I've never met anybody that has the exact same approach. I wonder what it would do with the nostril. This is kind of a bull, isn't he? I went to draw a dragon and ended up drawing a bull. I guess he could be a dragon, like a dragon bull. And all I'm doing to, like, build up some of these forms is just color picking from different areas to get the value. When I start rendering, you know, things are a little bit different. I might lay down a gradient map and all sorts of fancy tools and then start laying in colors, or, you know, I might get, like, a form right away. But just for this specific topic, all I'm doing is sort of, like, just black and white, just to kind of, like, focus on these elements more than anything else right now. Yeah, just continuing to draw. I think I'm going to make it look more dragon-like by just adding, like, spikes. And if you're keeping things loose, the details build themselves. If you are the type of person to... Does he have ears? No, he doesn't have ears. He has horns, though. Should probably... Haven't really focused on those, so I kind of forgot about those horns, huh? I think the decision on the horns has kind of changed a little bit on how those would be angled, so I'm going to work on figuring that out a little bit. And again, there's a lot of things that I do sort of while rendering, but this is my approach. And I wanted to be honest about like how I build things up. I think this is the best way to do it. For me, you know, kind of show how I approach it. Trying to preserve this wolf lady a little bit. I feel like breasts are one of those things that I'll always need some kind of reference for. Because they just work so strangely. They're almost too loose a lot of times, where it's like they just want to conform to whatever. And they're in just such a different location. There we go. That's a little bit better. There. Let's see, let's give him some horns. Let's give him real basic horns for now. It's kind of a brawny looking fella. I wonder which direction his horns are going in. Kind of like, we can kind of build into that one. It's okay to cheat too. This is a pretty straight on angle, so this probably wouldn't work in every angle, but I'm going to use it to my advantage that it's going to work in this one. I'm going to copy. And that should have made a new layer, so I should have no problem just kind of flipping it and moving it over. Luckily, those didn't have any kind of like shading or anything that I'd have to worry about at that point. But I can use them as a nice foundation for like if they have any like plating on them. And have that like kind of idea that they're sort of plated with like spikes or something, I don't know. Like they're segmented, you know, these like segmented horns. I think ram's horns have like rings. Same thing with the spike here, like just breaking down like, oh, it would be a sphere, or I mean what do you call them? Cone. It'd be a cone. So thinking on that surface, like, okay, which direction is the surface going? Would it be going? And like, which direction would that cone look like? And what kind of would it end up looking like? You can build in like, go into as much detail as you kind of like choose to. You know, and I've basically like built up the foundation for this kaiju snaggletooth, you know, guy in one go, and then or not in one go, but like in passes of like, okay, I'm gonna figure out where is my snout, I'm gonna figure out, you know, where are my eyes, I'm gonna figure out, you know, all that stuff in its most basic form first, and then just start to keep going. And I probably, like, if I weren't just, like, focusing on the sort of gestural aspect of things, I'd fold this right into rendering and just keep going in passes and passes and passes of, like, okay, fixing problems or defining areas that I want to define in either of these images. Just each pass I do of, like, an area, I'm fixing issues, I'm defining forms, I'm trying to figure out, like, how something, how the light's hitting something, how is it functioning in the form. I'm gonna say she has, like, paw feet, so I feel like drawing toes. There we go. Hands I put off for a while. Hands I'll figure them out, but I will do them at a leisurely pace, because they're hands. I think you know what I'm talking about. Those hands. For, like, fingers and stuff, I might actually, like, get in there and, like, do the same thing, but on its own kind of scale. And they're one of those things where, like, everything I just said, but to the extreme. To the extreme. References all the way. Taking pictures of my own hand, and, like, keeping it loose and trying really hard, but, trying really hard to keep it loose and, like, solve. It's, instead of, like, trying to get it right the first time, just trying to solve the form, like, like a puzzle. She's liking a pinky, but this person's pinky is hiding behind their other thing too, so I'm gonna say that it's there. That little light indicates that it's there. Just pause. I've determined that form. Fearlessly kind of erasing into forms. Trying to figure out where her hips are. Where's that lighting really gonna hit? Getting things to where they look decent. Might crunch everything down right now if I wanted to use, if I'm at a point where I feel like I want to use the liquify tool. I know I went over it before, but Control Alt Shift, so Control plus Alt plus Shift plus E, that right there will condense everything that you do into a flattened copy. So now you can kind of, like, see on the layers panel, like, I have a fully, like, just flattened copy of it, so it makes the liquify tool less scary to use too, just because you are not, you should look at that, I forgot what I was trying to liquify. Yeah, it makes the liquify tool less scary to use. I think I'm actually going to attempt to fix areas of her arm. Oh, her shoulder. I wanted to mess with her shoulder some. So I think her arm would come up. what her back would be. No, her back would be kind of... It's looking like that in the reference, where her shoulder's kind of doing a weird thing and her back's kind of up. You know, actually her head still might be way too big. I don't know why her... I think it's because I keep making her fluffier. That was the wrong tool. Oh, I gotta wait for this to fix itself. There we go. Like I said, I'm fairly certain it's because I kept making her fluffier and fluffier and fluffier. I didn't really plan for her to be a fluffy dog person. So that kind of does it. I'm just gonna... I want to change some aspects about this arm. I've seen other helpful hints too, like regarding like the idea of draw the hand first and then figure out what the rest of the arm is doing, which can also be helpful, like just taking a part and then, because it'll help you, like, okay, the hand is in a natural position, I have to figure out where like the rest of it is, or something like that, which can be helpful sometimes. And definitely, like, even if you're not at your computer, you can kind of, like, practice, in a sense, by, looking around at people, you know, and how they kind of naturally, or animals or whatever, and how what poses and kind of, situations are natural for them. You know, because, like, you could have this pose that is formally accurate, that is accurate on the level of, yes, the human body can do that, and the pose is technically correct, but is it one that is natural for the body to move in? For example, yes, the body can T-pose, but you don't really see anybody walking around like that. And it looks, you know, if you've ever, like, found a model and it glitches out and goes into T-pose or something like that when you're playing, like, a video game, if you play video games, you know, it looks very unnatural because that's not how people naturally kind of, like, sit or stand or function. So, you know, kind of, like, taking into account, like, observing, you know, in real time, real world what comes naturally to the human form, or to whatever form you're trying to portray. Work for, animals. Just figuring out where things are. In each animal, I can do like a generic kind of animal running form here, but if I have like a specific animal that I recognize, that the body is inspired from, I might, I would go look up, that animal so that I can like figure out what is the most, accurate way for its neck to kind of rest while it's running, or for which direction its feet are going to go in, or each animal has like a different gait. So a deer runs differently than a horse, and so like mid-run its legs are going to be in a slightly different position. Same thing with a cat or a dog or anything like that. So their forms are going to describe a little bit differently. Or be described a little bit differently, I should say. This guy's just like staring up at the sun. You can tell I'm more invested in animals. He's just wearing a mask now. What if he's an owl? But I think that just keeping it loose and keeping it simple are just two of the more powerful kinds of things that you can kind of do for yourself, and like not immediately committing to any shape or form right away, and just sort of like exploring them and referencing and trying to figure out how to, what shapes best describe what your intention is. And if you don't have like an intention right away, like you're not really sure, you just want to practice like the sheer like, form and everything like that, looking at pictures and just like, that's your intention. Just figure out, how to break down the image. And I think figuring out like how other people do it is good, because it gives you like, maybe the way that I approach the visual problem, the visual puzzle doesn't click with you, but someone else's way might. But like also, just doing it and figuring out like what kind of works for you. What is your visual dialect, so to speak? Like, do you, see things better when you start with the lines? Or maybe you see things better when you start with shapes. And that's really important, too, is, like, just figuring out, like, your own kind of paths. I think that kind of, like, ends anything useful I could have to say about anything outside of just rambling on forever. So thank you. I was very, very excited to get your question, and very excited to attempt to help. And I can't say that enough that like it was very exciting for me to like get a question like this, and I hope that anything I said, could be of help to you. And thank you so much for letting me ramble on.